Thanks for joining us for this webinar on the Texas redistricting and what's facing Texas and the nation. This is called Drawing the Future, the high-stakes battle over gerrymandering across the nation. My name is Grose, and I'm a professor of political science and public policy at USC and the academic director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. Today, we're going to hear from several esteemed guests who I'll introduce shortly, but I want to just give a little bit of an overview of what the USC Schwarzenegger Institute does. Governor Schwarzenegger is currently in a meeting and is not able to attend, but will be watching this webinar later. The institute was founded in 2012 to focus on political and election reform. Governor Schwarzenegger emphasized political reform and especially independent redistricting commissions when he was governor, got that reform passed in 2008, 2010. This particular webinar and what the institute does is educational and nonpartisan in our approach. We educate students, we teach students, and we educate the public on these issues. And that's why we're here today to talk about Texas and gerrymandering in Texas and potential opportunities for reform. So we're first going to hear from Representative Jean Wu, who is a Democrat in the Texas State Legislature and one of the leaders fighting against the mid-decade redistricting in Texas. Representative Wu represents District 137 in Texas. He, prior to being elected to the state legislature in 2012, he served as prosecutor in the Harris County DA's office, where he sought justice for thousands of crime victims. Since being elected state representative, Gene has maintained a focus on improving the lives of Texas children. He has authored numerous pieces of legislation supporting greater justice for juveniles, specifically fighting the school-to-prison pipeline and passing comprehensive CPS reform. Gene has also been appointed to the Texas Access to Justice Commission and the Texas State Child Fatality Review Team. Representative Wu, your bio is fully in the chat, and so I want to just talk specifically about mid-decade redistricting and find out what's going on in Texas, just to set the stage a little bit more for those of you who are joining us and aren't familiar with the topic. Redistricting is typically done every 10 years following the census. Every state draws lines differently. Texas redraws their lines usually every 10 years after the census and did so in 2021. But now we have something new going on. Can you just tell us what's going on in Texas in terms of the redistricting right now?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much. And again, thank you to the Schwarzenegger Institute for having me here. I think this is an important topic for all Americans to be aware of and to learn from. We've conceded too much of this knowledge and power to the political elites, and like our communities need to start taking some of that power back. Look, first thing you have to understand is since the Voting Rights Act was passed, Texas has been in violation of the Voting Rights Act in terms of racial gerrymandering, illegal racial gerrymandering, every single time that Texas has redrawn maps. Like, it's been found in violation. And it was no different in 2021. The 2021 maps are currently in litigation. We finished up a 3-week trial on the 2021 maps just a month ago. The court is still deliberating at this moment. And before they even finished deciding whether or not there was, again, intentional racial discrimination in the 2021 maps, we're already talking about doing more racial gerrymandering in 2025, midway through the cycle. I mean, literally, we are waiting at this moment with bated breath for the court to say that the 2021 maps were racially gerrymandered. And they're using our dislike of the 2021 map as an excuse to do this redistricting, saying that, well, we're going to correct the racial gerrymandering that we said in court did not exist, right? This is one of those things where, like me as a trial lawyer, I would ask them on a stand, so were you lying then or are you lying now? And, and the frustration of all this is that the only way for them to do what Donald Trump has asked them to do, which is give him 5 seats. That's what he asked for. He wants 5 seats, and they're going to give it to him. The only way to do this is to take already racially gerrymandered maps and make them more racially gerrymandered, right? To do what was already illegal and and double down, triple down, quadruple down on it. And right now we're actually, I have the hearing up behind me this morning in the committee hearing. They're saying, well, we created new Latino districts, we created new Black districts. Well, but they didn't say that, by the way, we took 2 Black districts and smashed them into one. And we took Latino performing districts and created a new district that we think will elect a Latino, but in reality will only ever elect a white Republican time and time again. We've seen this play over and over again. It's not a new thing. And they argue that, well, people should be free to pick the candidate of their choice. It shouldn't be about party. And we were saying, yes, that's exactly right. The problem is for them, and the problem for our communities is that in many places, who people vote for is closely tied to their ethnic background. And the easiest way to carve them out is to do it by racial lines. And that's what they're doing, right? And they're saying that this is just purely political. Nope. There's lots and lots of lines that they're cutting and redrawing that have nothing to do with Republican CVAP or Democratic CVAP. But it's about the race of the people in those districts. And here's my big thing. This doesn't just affect Texas. This is not a Texas problem. This is not a Democratic problem. This is an American problem. Because you've seen the news. Other states are making noise. Ohio, Missouri have already stated they're very, very interested and they're watching what Texas does. And they're saying we'll do the same. Because what's 5 seats to Trump in a wave year? Nothing. The wave's going to swallow that. But what if it's 25 seats? What if it's 55 seats? That's a different story.
So just to get everyone caught up to speed, so you're talking about this court case that's going through, right? There's the map right now is potentially illegal based on voting rights grounds, and that's what's been alleged. Right. And then the map is being redrawn as potentially as a pretense because of that. Right. But what are the chances that the court case gets decided next week, right? Or is it going to be more like many months? And this,
I'm not sure it's going to matter.
Okay.
Because the court case comes out and says, yeah, there's racial gerrymandering. And the legislature simply says, well, it doesn't matter. We have a new map anyways. Right. And then the new map will get litigated for another 3 years. Meanwhile, they're running on these maps.
Yeah, so how unusual is it for Texas to engage in mid-decade redistricting? Like, so this is very unusual across the country.
Yeah, no, this is unusual across the nation. The only other time that this has happened was in Texas in 2003. And that was a big old mess as it was, right? The concern isn't that they're doing it here at this time. The concern is that every state will do this from now on. The concern is that every state, every red state will redraw their maps every single cycle because they can, because there's no one to stop them, because no court's going to stop them. The people aren't going to stop them. And every time they come into a slight disadvantage, they'll just redraw the maps. And what that ultimately means for everyone as Americans is once politicians no longer feel the need to listen to you, no matter what party you're in, once they feel completely safe in their jobs, that they don't have to worry about what people want, it's game over for everybody. And we're already seeing this. We're seeing this in Texas right now. We see dealing with the school voucher issues, school funding issues, dealing with banning THC. These are things that were greatly opposed on both sides by Democrats and Republicans. Republicans still did it because even though their constituents are calling them 24 hours a day, they still did it, telling them not to do it, and they still did it because they're not worried about their elected officials. They're not worried about their voters anymore because they're so safe.
So the threat nationally is there. You're mentioning the threat nationally. Texas, Missouri, other states. There's Democratic leaning states that are talking about retaliation as well. What does this mean for voters? Like if we end up in a nuclear arms race of gerrymandering across the country, what's the impact on your voters in Texas and voters across the country in terms of their representative relationship?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think Democratic states, in the states that we've talked to, they don't want to do this, but they don't see that there's really any other choice. This is a Cold War, and you can't have one side that just simply says we refuse to respond, right? If they launch nukes, we have to launch nukes, kind of deal. The problem is, if everyone launches nukes, all we'll have left is just a wasteland. And this is what it's going to be. If blue states and red states all do this, makes the opposition irrelevant. Nobody will be listened to anymore. Everything will just be party politics. Everything will just be internal. There won't be elected officials who care about what the public wants and has to say on either side.
So what are you going to do in Texas? You meaning the Democratic caucus? What's the legislative caucus's plan over the next 3 weeks?
I mean, I think to our membership, it's now very clear what the stakes are. That this is not a Texas Democrats problem, right? This is an America problem. The fundamental basis of our democracy is that the people, when they're unhappy, can choose new leaders and can force a change. If you make it so that doesn't matter anymore, that, as long as you survive the Republican primary, that's all that matters. That's the end of our democracy. I mean, how else can I put it? If the people who we elect to govern us no longer worry about the people, put them there, what's to stop them ever? I mean, look at what's happening in the White House right now. Look what's happening in U.S. Congress. With a 2-seat majority, they've gutted our nation.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, but I want to open up the chat to those who are participating as well. So if you've got questions, go ahead and submit them. Before we started, you mentioned that you were a fan of, this is a little bit of a shift in questions.
Sure.
You mentioned that you had followed Governor Schwarzenegger on Reddit occasionally and shared some of his views on gerrymandering. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? I think it'd be interesting for our audience to hear about that.
I followed Governor Schwarzenegger onto Reddit. I was not a Redditor for a long time, and then I kept seeing some of his posts, and I thought that was really cool. I said, "Hey, I've been there. I'm a nerd." But look, I know Governor Schwarzenegger has been at the forefront of trying to bridge that partisan divide. I know, he was a Republican governor in a very blue state, and I think that's a very telling thing. And I think that's probably a very good experience to have, is say, like, look, we can govern for all. There is a way that we can govern for all. And there's a way we can work together to make sure that no one is left behind, that we don't have to pick winners and losers every single time. We can have all Americans be winners. And there's ways to do that. And I think we need more of those voices to say, like, look, this is too much. At some point, I really hope the American people say enough on both sides. The partisan bickering doesn't help us. These constant little power plays that everyone does, this is not good for the people. This distracts from the people. Because look, the rationale for why Governor Abbott called a special session was because of the 4th of July Kerrville disasters. 130 plus Texans are dead. And some of these bodies we may never find them. Right? 40 young children drowned. And this was a preventable disaster. And that was the reason the governor called this special session. We have not heard a single bill dealing with that, because 100% of the time has been sucked up by redistricting. Right?
Thanks. And so we have two.
This is where we get to time and time again, that politicians talk about all the things that we're going to do to protect you and protect your family. But when they get here, they work on politics. And I hope the people get tired of this at some point.
So we have several questions in the chat, and I want to just ask some of them to you. So one is from Russia, a person named Russia. What can voters, residents, and elected officials in other states do to support Texas instead of adopting mid-decade gerrymandering in their states?
Do everything you can. So here's my basic thing. 1, educate yourself, educate everyone around you. The people who have made this possible have spent the last 50 years telling Americans that politics is too complicated, it's too boring, you wouldn't understand it. So just don't pay any attention to it. And it doesn't affect you anyways. It doesn't matter who you vote for, it's all the same, right? They've been spending so much time telling you that people believe that. And we now have a population that does not understand their own lives and how their lives are being governed. Explain it to them. Tell them why this is important. Help them learn. Learn yourself. Learn what gerrymandering is. Learn what all this stuff is. We need people to know that their democracy and their voice is at stake. And second thing is get organized. Teach yourself, teach other people. Then once they know, get them organized, get them together, start talking about it in groups, start planning to do stuff. And then third, once you are educated, you are organized, get active, take action, go do something, figure out what you can do, figure out what you need to do. Whether that's organizing more people, whether it's talking to more people, whether it's forming groups, whether it's going for a protest, whether it's going to a march, whether you're going to have a sit-in, whatever it is, civil disobedience. Educate, organize, take action. That's it.
Well, a follow-up on that. I know one of your colleagues has introduced a bill to create an independent redistricting commission in Texas that's very similar to the model in California. The chances of that passing right now are obviously low.
Yeah.
But what are the ways to create mechanisms like that are more forward-looking than retaliatory in nature? What can be feasible in Texas or elsewhere?
Look, I mean, I'm not sure how to get that kind of legislation passed in the state other than the people demanding it. Because right now, I think there's too many Texans who feel like, oh, the partisanship games, the partisan games that we play, all these little shenanigans that we do, it's working out for us. They don't see all the harm it's doing to their own community and their own lives, and we're trying to get that out to them. If they understood what this kind of stuff does to them individually, I think they would change their minds. Because every time we do this stuff, we're not working on things that matter. Every time we make it a little safer for politicians, like for example, the easiest example, if people want at home, is because of COVID, because of inflation, our school system had a $16.5 billion deficit. $16.5 billion. You know what the legislature, Republican-controlled legislature, put in to fix it? 8. And they said it's fixed. And that kind of thing you can only get away with is if you're not afraid of losing your seat. If you're not afraid of the people, if you're not afraid of your community, that's what you do. Because people who listen to their community, people who are afraid of them, would not cut education funding, would not leave our schools to close. And there is real consequence for this. And I think people need to understand that just because you think it only hurts Democrats and only hurts people in the cities, doesn't mean that it does. And people are finding out that the hard way right now with Trump's big ugly bill, right? That they think it was designed to just hurt people that they don't like, but they're realizing it's shutting down farms, it's shutting down factories, it's shutting down businesses all across the country just the same.
So we have another question that I want to ask you from an anonymous attendee. You and your colleagues have recently toured California. Welcome to our state. I'm not sure if you were in Illinois or if you were in California, but I know a number of your colleagues were in California. You went to Illinois? Okay. And met with Governor Newsom. How is this impacting your thoughts and strategy?
So, I mean, the point of what we were doing is trying to raise the alarm. There's too many people, especially in blue states, who look at this with just like, oh, it's Texas. As long as it stays there, it'll be fine, right? What we're trying to tell people is this is not a just Texas play. This is something that's going to spread across the country. You need to prepare for it now. Even in blue states, they may try some type of action, lawsuits or whatever it is, to force some kind of redistricting, to force these type of actions. And everybody has to be ready. And even if it's just red states, blue states need to figure out a way to counter it. Because again, look at Trump's big ugly bill. That doesn't just affect blue states. It doesn't just affect Democrats. It affects everyone. The people being fired, the veterans are being fired. there's no qualifier from if they're from Texas or not, or if they're Democrats or not. None of that. People are going to suffer whether they're in blue states or red states, and we need people to know that. Just because you're in a blue state now does not mean that you're safe. And it is incumbent upon all Americans. If you believe in this country, if you believe in the American dream, if you believe in the idea that what this country is about is hard work and following the rules, like, you got to fight for that now. You got to stand up for that now, because what's coming is not that.
So we have several questions that are similar. I'm going to fold a couple together.
Right.
But one thing we've been talking about is the partisan impact of the Texas plan. Trump asked the Texas redraw its congressional map only, not the state legislative districts. The data, based on looking at it, appears to be approximately a 5-seat gain for Republicans in what was already a Republican-leaning map. That's a net 10 seats when you think about the wins and the losses. However,
explain the current ratio.
Yeah, so the current ratio is already above the typical vote in Texas. So Texas right now, Republicans are getting 52, 56% of the vote in statewide offices. It kind of depends on what election. Like the Attorney General, when Ken Paxton ran, was particularly low for Republicans. Trump did fairly well in 24, getting about 56, but lower in 2020. But on balance, it's a leaning Republican state. It's probably not quite as Republican as most people, in California think. And Democrats are getting in the mid 40s in the state.
What's the current congressional makeup?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot, but like the current congressional makeup is significantly more than 55% Republican. It's closer to about 3/4 Republican, if I've got the numbers right, but I think you would know more. And then this map, the plan would be to go to 30 Republicans and 8 Democrats, assuming that the map passes. And so it's taking a Republican-leaning redistricting plan and turning it into a much stronger Republican-leaning plan. And so I think it's worth pointing that out, and that the partisan stakes are there. But what's also come up, you mentioned this at the opening of your remarks, and we've got 2 questions, one from Alex, one from an anonymous attendee, that says, what is the impact of this mid-decade redistricting on people of color? What's the impact on diverse communities? So we've got partisan gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court, has said is legal, for unfortunately, but that is the case. But the Voting Rights Act and race-related redistricting, there are still significant legal components that have to be followed. So what is the impact legally, not just on the partisan component, but on the representation of people of color?
And look, I'll start this. I've said this, and I know congressional members have said this, is we don't care about us. Like, we had Congressman Al Green, Congressman Kassar from Austin, all have publicly said, I don't care if I don't come back, right? This is not about me. This is not about Democrats winning or gaining seats. This is about our communities. We have strong communities of interest in the Valley, in Houston, in Austin, in Dallas, minority communities who have spent a lot of time being left out in the cold, who had no political power and over the decades built up that political power. And what they propose to do is, for a lot of these communities, is now that they've built up this community of interest, this community of power, let's just go ahead and split them up. Let's carve them into other areas. Let's take, high-performing Latino areas and shove them somewhere else. Carve them up, shove them somewhere else. In Houston, we had 2 congressional districts represented by very strong Black elected officials. 1 seat held by my mentor, Sylvester Turner, then previously held by Sheila Jackson Lee, and including people like Mickey Leland and Barbara Jordan, and the other seat being held by Congressman Al Green, right? The man who openly stood up and defied Donald Trump at the State of the Union. And it's no surprise that they're taking 2 of these districts held by 2 strong, what would look like 2 strong Black Democrats, and smash them into 1. All right. And they say, well, and their reasoning for that was, well, we're giving the Black community a 51% CVAP. I don't think the Black community ever asked for that, because I think the Black community was happier having 2 representatives instead of 1. Right.
So one additional question. Your colleagues have talked about breaking quorum, which is what was done in 2003, the last time that something like this was tried in Texas. Do you intend to break quorum?
Look, I mean, given the how extreme their actions are. I mean, look at the hearing that I'm watching right now. On something this big, they released a map that they're going to use less than 48 hours ago, right? And in response to that, they released this massive map 48 hours ago, and they're closing online submissions for comments now. And I said, why? Why close off the comments? Why not just allow? I mean, like you're already not going to have regional hearings, so let those communities have their say. We had these 3 sham hearings around the state where witness after witness says, "Where's the map? What are we here talking about? Right? Why are you even here if you're not going to show us a map? How can we comment on something when we can't see it?" And it's this type of this underhanded gamesmanship. Like, we know how important this is to them, and we know how important this is to us. Democrats are going to do whatever it takes. And I'm not going to talk about our internal discussions, but all I can tell you is we understand. Democrats here in Texas understand this is the boss fight. This is the final fight. Once they no longer need us anymore, once they no longer care about our voices and what we have to say, once they can redistrict whenever they feel like, and they can just carve out people they don't like, it's game over. It's game over. So Democrats are not only fighting for Texas, we're not fighting for Democrats. We're fighting for all Texans. Democrats, Republicans are nothing at all. We're fighting for the middle class. We're fighting for the American dream. And I don't say that like.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it. Are there any last words that you want to share that our students and people in California or across the country should know or think about to take action regarding Texas redistricting or redistricting elsewhere?
No, no. Look, I am outrageously proud to be an American. And, I was born in China, and I grew up in this country hearing about how great it is, how wonderful it is, that this is the land of opportunity. This is the land where it doesn't matter what your last name is. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It shouldn't matter who you were born to. That this is a place where if you work hard and you fight, you can win. And over time, that has been stripped away from us, not just from me, people look like me, not just stripped away from African Americans or Latinos, but stripped away from every American. And the way they win is to tear us apart and make us fight each other. They happily pit Black against Latino, Latino against Asians, and however else that works. And what I hope that we do, the response from Americans, from a response from all good people is enough. Enough. I hope everyone has had enough and they're ready to fight for the American dream.
All right. Well, thank you, Representative Wu, for coming to the Schwarzenegger Institute and telling us about what's happening in Texas. We really appreciate your time and good luck wherever you go next, be it Austin or Oklahoma.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Next, we're going to shift gears and move on to our panel discussion of experts. And we have 3 really great people that know this work inside and out that are going to speak to us. We have David Daley, a journalist, Professor Seth McKee and Pamela McCann from the Oklahoma State and the University of Southern California, respectively. Their bios are in the chat, but very brief bios. David has been following this work on redistricting and gerrymandering for decades, has written significantly about Texas, has written significantly about gerrymandering in the 2010 cycle, has been an advocate of commissions in his own work and an anti-gerrymandering reforms broadly. Professor Seth McKee is an expert on Texas politics, even though he lives down the way in Oklahoma and at Oklahoma State. He's written hundreds of articles on redistricting and politics, and probably 20 of those or so are about Texas redistricting. He's written about mid-decade redistricting back in 2003 as well. And Pam McCann is an associate professor of public policy at the Sol Price School here at USC. Her expertise is federalism and policy diffusion across the states. Typically, policy diffusion is considered a positive, where ideas spread from one state to another. This particular thing we're discussing here is more about diffusion of perhaps bad ideas across states. But the three of you are going to be really great on the panel, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. So my first question is just what reactions do you have, if any, to what Representative Wu had to say about Texas, and then implications that has for other states? David, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks to the Institute for having me. I agree with Representative Wu deeply on the stakes here. I think the stakes are deeply consequential for all Americans. We are looking at a U.S. House that has a margin of about 3 seats for Republicans, and we're heading into a 2026 midterm election. And midterm elections ought to be the time when Americans have the ability to cast a verdict on how things are going, and that verdict ought to actually be meaningful. It ought to have a consequence. And I think clearly what the president asked for when he went to Texas and said, "Give me 5 seats," is a cushion that will make it easier to hold on to the House. And you're looking at 3 seats already as an advantage. You add somewhere from 3 to 5 in Texas. It jumps. I think we're likely to see 2 more from a new map in Ohio. I mean, that process actually is not even optional. That process is going to happen because they only passed a 4-year map in Ohio. You've got 2 very close seats in northern Ohio. I imagine both of those are drawn to be non-competitive. This is going to go to Missouri after that, Indiana. It could certainly happen in Kentucky. It could happen in North Carolina. There's more seats to be had in Florida, New Hampshire potentially. So this is heading nationwide. Retaliation, I think this is the place I might separate myself just a little bit from Representative Wu, in that I don't think this is a case of big bad Republicans doing something terrible and Democrats not having any tools left to fight it. I think Democrats shot their ammunition back in 2021 in many of these states, and they've already drawn themselves outrageous gerrymanders of their own in Maryland, in Illinois, in the states where people are looking for Democrats to try and compensate for what's happening in Texas. Going to be pretty tough to do that because Democrats have already gone ahead and helped themselves to those seats. I think it's one more reason why we need a national solution to a national problem. And I think it's one more reason why we ought to look really seriously at the decision the U.S. Supreme Court handed down in 2019 that closed the federal courts to a solution on partisan gerrymandering at exactly the time when the lower federal courts, judges appointed by presidents of both parties, looking at extreme gerrymanders drawn by Democrats in Maryland and by Republicans in Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and said, we have the tools to fix this. And the court and John Roberts said, yeah, that's all sociological gobbledygook. I don't understand it. And here we are. I think there's a real straight line from that decision 6 years ago and the festival of partisan gerrymandering that Paul Smith warned that we would see, and has really been enabled in states across the country to the point that we had 37 districts out of 435 within 5% back in 2024. And you start knocking those seats off in Texas and Ohio and in other states, the competitive map really dwindles. Primaries become all important. Extremists take hold. It's deeply polarizing. It's a difficult mess to find our way out of.
Seth, what do you think is going on specifically in Texas? Like, so what we've talked about the plan, but what do you think the impact is going to be in Texas on the elections in 2026?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think it could be a net win for Republicans, but I think that it's also a gamble. If you looked at the state we're in today, literally with tariffs and the economy, I still think there's enough swing in the electorate in banking on Hispanics who are lower propensity voters to sort of push these districts over the finish line. I think there's a risk here. I really do. 3 of those districts have about a 10-point margin based on the 2024 presidential vote. I think 2 of them, based on the 2020 presidential vote, actually were to Biden. So I think that, I don't know, I never look at these things as cataclysmic because I'm an academic, and I think that the parties fight tooth and nail, and I don't know whether there's necessarily a right and wrong here in terms of sort of my perspective on this. I mean, voters are Republicans and Democrats and independents for a reason. Texas is a heavily Republican state that sort of trended away from that. But the trend back towards the Republican Party in Texas is based on Hispanics. Hispanics who shifted strongly to the Republican Party after 2016. And, we'll see if that trend continues with this map. But I think the VRA is another issue because, as already talked about, the 9th district is basically a new district, and that would reduce Black representation from what would before.
That's in Houston. Just interrupt, but for the
right, in Houston, and so you really reduce Black representation by 1 there. Assuming that the 18th would stay an African American district that's vacant right now, but that could be an issue because the Supreme Court recently has moved to protect the VRA if we look at places like Alabama and Louisiana. So I think there's just a lot of moving parts here. And I also think that Texas Republicans are going to be hard pressed to win all 5 that they want. So I'll leave it there.
So, David, do you want? I read a piece you read in Salon recently where you said you're on a lot of panels with political scientists, and we don't always have the same level of intensity that you think we should. Do you want to? I just want to give you a chance to respond to Professor McKee's point there, if you'd like, and then I want to send a question to Professor McKee.
It's always dangerous to say anything like that. It always comes back at me in a panel. I think that the technology that is used to draw these districts these days is so intense and so sophisticated and precise that what we haven't really seen is a single district that has turned into a dummy mander or that has backfired on a party over these last 2 cycles. Through elections that have had waves, right? And state legislatures and also congressional districts, something changed. I used to be on panels in which, people would, pull out charts from, redistricting washes out because in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and I'd say, something really different happened in 2010. And whenever the journalist on the panel says something different happened, right? It's, wait and see, and we'll, look at it later. But I think if we were to, I think what we're beginning to really understand is that the way that redistricting changed in the 2010 cycle, that these are much more precise, these are much more sophisticated. They've proven themselves to really be impervious to waves. The only gerrymander that has backfired is the one that Democrats drew in Arkansas in 2010, when Democrats in Arkansas actually thought they could hold on to 3 or 4 seats, and that didn't work out so well for them. The maps Republicans did in Wisconsin and North Carolina and in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and all of these purplish states, at the state legislative level and at the congressional level have nearly been unbeatable now for 15 years. And I think that adds an extra level of danger and consequence to what we're talking about.
All right, so Professor McCann, I've got a question for you. Your research shows how ideas go across state lines. What's going to happen here? Texas started by doing mid-decade redistricting. A lot of states are looking into redrawing their own lines. Is that possible? And 2, what are some of the constraints that different states may have in being able to redraw their lines?
These are great questions, first off. And I think before I answer it, I want to step back just for a moment to talk about what do we mean? Like, what is districting? Why does it even exist? Because this actually bears quite a bit on my answer to that. And if you think about it, districting exists because voters matter, at least for the moment, hopefully for a while, if we take what the earlier respondents have said. But if you think about the debates of the framers of our government, this allows people to elect someone to represent them and their interests in state legislatures. Here we're talking about in Congress in particular. And so the theories that these localized interests, the voters sort of supporting, propping up, undergirding, holding these representatives responsive to them, that they can bring those interests into DC to be incorporated in the policy process, whether it's through budgeting or dealing with crises, regulating or deregulating businesses. And because the US is a federal Republican democracy, which is where my research really settles, there's a lot of important power that resides with the states. And, we could have a whole webinar on that part of it, but the states aren't these passive receptacles of voters for the federal government, for Trump to call up Greg Abbott and ask for, redraw these lines. And yet, because the states draw the lines, they define those districts that provide buckets of voters. And so it's a really important thing to start thinking about. And so then, once we sort of establish that sort of my basis or understanding of what districting is and how it works, then it's important to think about the fact that states vary so much across their borders, not just in geography and environments, but their people, their culture, their economies, and how their governments are set up. So this includes everything from the length of their constitution to how easy or how you amend the constitution, the powers of the governor, capacity of their legislatures, whether you elect state attorneys general or the secretary of state or even judges. Some judges are appointed, other judges are elected. There's all sorts of differences from state to state, whether or not voter initiatives exist and how those work, and whether and how, in fact, legislatures and voter initiatives work together. All of those sorts of things differ quite a bit from states to states. And if you look prior to the 1960s and 1970s, at the state level, most state legislatures were drawing these districts after the census, as you mentioned earlier. But then after some important decisions in the 60s and 70s and federal legislation, redistrict processes, technology, just like the last respondent was discussing, technology has evolved. And so today it's about 33 states have if you don't include states that are one member, have just the one district, they have their legislature design those districts, and district lines pass just like regular legislation. And so there's a majority vote in each chamber, subject to the veto of a governor. 7 states have advisory commissions or backup commissions. And so advisory commissions, they come in and provide the legislature with advice over how to do the commission. And then the legislature, again, makes these choices. Backup commissions are ones who come in afterwards if the legislature hasn't been able to make this decision with respect to drawing the lines in time. But still, the legislature has a huge role in these. There's about 15 or 16, depending on how you want to count Alaska, states who have delegated the power to commissions. Some of those commissions are really tightly tied to politics, and others are really independent. And there's a spectrum of those, of course. And so, in terms of, and if you look at independence, it can be with strong ethical guardrails, with public disclosure and transparency requirements, and other attempts to limit political influence. So in terms of, can states do this? Sure, they can try. Can it hold? And will it matter is a whole other question, because it's complicated. All of this is very complex. The federal relationship between states, feds, the federal legislature, and between courts and what's happening is pretty tricky terrain to walk through. And so, so that's my question there, answer to that question. But
can I follow up on that? So in Texas, what are the guardrails, if any, on them engaging in mid-decade redistricting? And then in other states like California that have been discussing, what are the guardrails in California?
Yeah, so Texas is a state where the state legislature can draw those district lines. The mid-decennial, so in the middle of it's not right after a census, is unusual, and so and I think as one of the respondents said earlier, there's a lot of things that are being litigated right now, and so we don't actually know. I think you had mentioned this earlier. What is the outcome of the litigation with respect to the Texas redistricting plan from before? And so that will probably have some bearing on that. But that is, so in the state of Texas, it just it requires basically state legislative votes. So that should be really interesting to see. In California, it's quite different. So we have an independent commission. And that was something, it's in the Constitution. And so if in fact, but that's with respect to the census itself. So after every census, that there's this independent commission, and in terms of the qualifications of the people that can be on it, how they are vetted, as well as there's restrictions in terms of political influence, ethics, and disclosure with respect to, I also think you can't go into lobbying right after or be, and so there's all sorts of different ways in which the state of California is trying to limit the political influence. And yet, because this is a before the 2030 census is out, and they've already established the map in the state of California, can in fact, as Governor Newsom has suggested, can they actually go back to the voters and ask them to, almost like a trigger strategy in some ways, which is happening in the state of New York, which is another state with some independent commission history. And so what would happen is then it would say, going to the voters, likely in 2026, perhaps. And so that's not something that's going to stop this redistricting plan from happening in Texas, and what the implications will be in the House of Representatives following the 2026 election. And so timeline matters here. In the state of New York, there's an interesting bill that just got proposed a couple of days ago by a couple of legislators, where they say anytime a state redistricts in the midst of, so in this mid-decennial, that they can then do redistricting in the state of New York. Of course, this again, just because of the process within the state of New York, they have to go through the two legislative sessions, and that would mean even just that itself means that it's not going to be in place in time for the 2026 election. So yes, there are these things that exist. And so in some ways, is this just talk? And I don't even want to call it cheap talk. I think it's political talk. It's talk that has some bearing, some meaning. And I can talk some more about that, or we can go on to the next question if you want.
Yeah, I want to open it up to everyone building off of that. Sort of what is so one thing we've been dancing around is like what's happening in California and the threatened retaliation, right? This webinar is focused on Texas and what's happening in Texas. But what can Newsom do anything unilaterally on his own in California given the constitutional protections? David, do you want to take that one?
I might not be the expert on the California Constitution that other people on this panel are. I mean, I think that any steps that he could take are extraordinarily complicated, would likely be litigated, and I think would probably run into trouble ahead of the 2026 election. He could try to put a ballot initiative to try to find a workaround around the Constitution. The legislature could attempt to argue that, well, the constitutional language is quiet on the question of a mid-decade redistricting, so we're going to go ahead and do it. I think that all of this is going to end up being litigated. I think the question becomes, California has the gold standard when it comes to how people should be drawing these lines. And do we want to go to a place where California tries to draw a 50-2 map or something to, penalize people in California, Democrats, Republicans, and independents for the bad behavior of those who are attempting to do mid-decade redraws elsewhere? To which, again, I would suggest that instead of this spiral to the bottom and a maximally gerrymandered map that's all red in red states and all blue in blue states, that what we need is a national solution. What we need is a more proportional solution. What we need is a solution in which voters actually make these decisions and not politicians picking winners and losers for, a decade.
So we want to open up to questions in the chat. There's one that's directly related to this point, though, so I'm going to start there. That's come in from a person watching. Do you believe the current debate over mid-decade reapportionment is cover for eventually getting rid of independent commissions? So, is Texas doing what they're doing not simply to try to game a Republican margin? Is this actually part of a plan to have an arms race between Republicans and Democrats across the country, blowing up redistricting commissions, engaging in the gerrymandering to the maximum extent that we've been talking about? I'll open it up. Who wants to take that one? Professor McKee, do you want to try that?
Sure. I don't think so. I don't think it's that big picture. I think it's how can we get some more Republican seats in Texas? I don't think they care about the more philosophical issue of whether you're using commissions or state legislators to draw districts. So there's my quick response.
Okay. One question that was sent to me was the Constitution does say in California now, moving to California, that a ballot initiative can be used to repeal a map. That's actually part of the Independent Redistricting Commission reforms that were passed, similar at the local level and places that also have commissions. The governor yesterday mentioned that may be a route that he's thinking about doing. How does that differ from sort of some of the more unilateral actions that seem to be more constitutionally murky that we've been discussing? And what would that mean for the Independent Redistricting Commission movement broadly? Pam, do you want to take that one?
So I can take I can take part of that. I think I'm not going to answer it satisfactorily, I think. So first of all, I kind of mentioned this to begin, like in the end of my last comments, that supposedly this is a trigger strategy because this is happening across, like, with Republicans, and then of course Ohio and some of the other states are also sort of scrambling, or not even scrambling, just watching and thinking, and some of them have to do some stuff. So I believe 2025 is Ohio, when Ohio's map has to come out before the 2026 election. At least I do know that. And so less murky, sure, but I think that the timeline just doesn't fit to make it actually do anything for the 2026 elections.
You're talking about California. So yesterday, Newsom said that he put a special election on the ballot this November.
So, but the problem is that if it's this November, how's he funding it? And if he's and I think it could backfire. I think it could cause all sorts of problematic things. So I guess it's possible. Of course, it's possible. The states can do all sorts of interesting things that then would go to court to be litigated and all those sorts of things. And so that's my answer to that part. In terms of is this cover for trying to do away with redistricting commissions? I agree with Seth. I don't think that that's the plan. I actually think it's a distraction from other things, is what it seems like to me. Voters aren't happy right now. And this is both Democratic and Republican voters aren't happy. If you look at the Gallup polls released yesterday, like really unhappy with their representatives, unhappy with the way the world looks right now. And so in some ways, this is a way to convince voters that they're strong, that they're coming out swinging in certain ways, and both Republican and Democratic sides. And so the problem is, I think that could also backfire. But I want you to go back to others to fully answer the question that you asked earlier. Sorry.
I said, David or Seth, do you want to weigh in on that? Like, what is sort of is the path that Newsom's proposing yesterday distinct from some of the other things that have been floated in California, New York, and elsewhere to retaliate against Texas? David, you want to weigh in on that?
At least that approach asks voters what they think, which I think is a step up, instead of unilaterally going ahead and having lawmakers who've already gerrymandered themselves into office decide that they're going to further gerrymander maps to help their side gain seats. But I don't think there's any guarantee that would be a successful strategy, right? I mean, I think we need to keep in mind why voters in California took this power away from lawmakers. They took this power away from lawmakers because lawmakers proved they couldn't be trusted with it, right? Because you had Democrats and Republicans in California who essentially sat in a room and divvied up the state's congressional delegation. And voters said enough. And are voters now going to hand that power right back over to lawmakers to re-gerrymander? I'm not convinced that they will. There's plenty of Democrats, plenty of Republicans, plenty of independents in the state of California who I would imagine really like having a commission that works the way the California Commission does, in which Democrats, Republicans, independents who have all been vetted, who have all qualified, sit in a room together, and after months of research and hearing community interest, try to work together to solve a complicated problem like drawing a map. And it has worked really, really well for California now over 2 cycles. So the idea that California voters are going to put a party back in charge, parties that have proven themselves not exactly fair-minded in this process, in order to be part of a national retaliatory arms race, seems not entirely certain to me.
All right, there's a few other questions in the chat that I want to get to. So one is just, how can individuals start to organize a national movement that would improve redistricting policy? And then specifically adding to that, are there specific reforms that have been proposed, right? In the present, there's certain bills nationally. Are there other things that are on the horizon? Some whether they're likely or not. Like what are the policies that could change nationally? to change redistricting. Seth, you want to take that one?
I mean, I honestly don't have a good response to that. So,
all right. So how about Pam? You want to take that one?
Well, I mean, it's hard to have a good response because it's really hard. And so I liked Representative Wu saying this is a national problem. It needs a national solution. So I was listening to a podcast of some of the New York state legislators talking about their trigger strategy and why they were doing that. And they were getting pushback because they were just like, but why would you do this when in fact like the incentives are really wonky if in fact state legislators are allowed to draw the boundaries to help people keep their job or not. That just messes it all up. And so of course they couldn't be trusted. And so of course we would need to do this because it's so delicious sounding to just make life a little easier, even if it's just for a minute, but then the next minute and the next minute. And so what are the ways in which a national solution could potentially happen? And this is also where it gets really tricky because there are court cases, there's federal legislation, there's constitution to take into account. There is currently a bill thinking about trying to this is me like trying to phrase this in I'm not sure what this would look like in the end even, but mandate states have independent redistricting commissions. That's a really interesting thought piece, perhaps. Now, would legislators, and in particular the current Congress, would they actually vote in a way that does not line up with what Trump has started asking is something that seems unlikely, although I think they're getting a lot of backlash in town halls. And if this is something that could at least divert some of the attention towards something else that would be good for democratic norms, depending on how the commissions were structured, what their ethics and transparency and vetting and qualifications might be across the states, and whether or not what's the limit of what Congress can tell states to do.
All right, I have another question that asks the strategies on partisan gerrymandering and other redistricting. Democratic and progressive organizations have tended to use a litigation strategy to affect redistricting, while Republicans have tended to draw maps that they know may be illegal and then wait it out. Do you all, I guess that's actually not a question. That's the end of the comment. There's no question at the end. That's a statement. So I'll make that a question. Do you think that is accurate? And do you think that, focusing more on Texas, do you think that's what Texas is planning? That they know that the map may not stand up in court, but they can buy some time between now and say 2028, 2030 and run a few elections? David, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think there's a lot of truth in there. Now, I also think that there's also a lot of Democratic gerrymanders in states where Democrats have the power to do that. So I think voters in Illinois and in Maryland and Oregon, New York might have a slightly different take. But I do think overwhelmingly nationally what we have seen, certainly if you go back to the 2010 cycle, Republicans ran a state legislative strategy called Red Map, the Redistricting and Majority Project. The goal of this is to win control of state legislatures and the map-making process ahead of the census and new maps in 2011. They locked them in all kinds of states because that was an anti-Obama Tea Party midterm year. It was a big Republican year. So they won the power to draw maps in all kinds of places that they might not have ordinarily had that power. Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, in addition to all of these other states. And they really understood how the technology had changed. So while Democrats were drawing, dummy manders in Arkansas, Republicans were drawing maps in Wisconsin and elsewhere that would withstand big waves. You had some, 54, 46 years in Wisconsin in 2018, and those maps didn't budge in any of those states. Almost elected supermajorities in those places. Democrats tried to fight this in the courts as best they could, and they had a lot of success until it arrived at the doorstep of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Common Cause versus Rucho case in 2019. And the Supreme Court, even though there'd been, really terrific decisions, very clear decisions, from, social scientists and computer scientists and data folks who say we can see through, we can use the same technology that they use to gerrymander to see through it. The judges said, we have all the tools we need. The Supreme Court said no, and we're going to close the federal courts to this. And when you close the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims, you effectively only leave open the state court route. And in many states, state courts are just as partisan as the U.S. Supreme Court has become, right? So in Florida, in 2010, more than 60% of voters passed an amendment, right? This was a winning issue, even in a Tea Party year in Florida. 60% of voters said, we are going to enact constitutional language that bans partisan gerrymandering. Florida's courts found the map to be partisan gerrymandered. In 2015, they ordered several new districts drawn. This current Florida map, probably more gerrymandered than the one that the courts threw out a decade ago, but the current court in Florida, very different, appointed by the current governor, and it upheld those maps regardless of the constitutional language. So this is a tough fight. It's a fight that probably has to be won via the kind of national legislation through Congress. But again, as the professors so wisely observed, getting members to stop a practice that they themselves were elected by, the incentives aren't always there.
Okay, so I have one question in the chat from a former student, Ian. So we definitely got to ask this question. Hello, Ian. Thank you for attending. It's great to see you. A massive expansion of the House seems in order, pegging the size of the district to the size of the smallest district, Wyoming. Would doubling or tripling the size of the U.S. House disarm some of this gerrymandering by forcing new or more compact districts? Seth, what do you think about that?
I think it's a non-starter. I don't see that happening anytime soon. If you were talking about expanding the size of the House by that magnitude, then you're going to have a massive advantage for Democrats. Just given, thinking about urban centers and being able to have more representation there. But I do want to say something that I hope isn't too far off the beaten path here. I do agree that the precision of redistricting has gotten better, but I don't think that that we should expect that we know what's going to happen in 2026. Trump lost 40 seats in 2018. He lost a seat in Oklahoma. I think that what Texans are doing, Republicans, is they reek of desperation. We don't know how many Republicans are going to show up in the midterm. We don't know how many Democrats are, but probably more Democrats than Republicans, because that tends to be the trend these days because of higher education. So I just want to push back a little bit and say that I'm almost certain that Trump's going to lose the House. And I think the only way he's going to keep the House is if only Republicans put in these gerrymanders and Democrats sit on their hands.
All right, so let's wrap it up with one final question for the entire panel. What is going to happen next? Like, is this going to be Texas begins and then Democratic states retaliate and then Republican states re-retaliate, and we could see 30, 40, 50, 60 districts being redrawn if not in the next year, in the next year to 2 to 3. And then what does that mean for voters? Pam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think that we will see at least the talk of it. Internal political dynamics across different states are hard. Politics is hard. They're brutal to come to, and it's, as many folks have mentioned here, it's really risky. Um, it's risky for the current incumbents, but it's also risky in terms of what's this going to do to voter participation. So if it's mudslinging and this like chest beating and, pulling out their lightsabers to fight across the country on this stuff, then that, although some of us get really excited to watch politics, others of us, that turns them off. And they're like, well, you know what? This is a waste of time. I'm just not going to participate, because if the representatives are choosing the voters, then my vote counts even less than it did before. And so that's one of the risks. And I think another one is that if you're voting in a district and you think it's rigged, why would you waste your time voting? And then in addition to that, another channel of possible implications, I think, are the quality of the contenders. You have an incumbent who's running for the next election against that incumbent. If in fact the system feels rigged, it is perceived as unfair in particular ways, then the quality of who comes up against them is really concerning. And the sway of special interests and campaign finance in all of this, wealthy elites, et cetera, is also incredibly worrisome. And then that's sort of the pre-election. And then post-election, you can see how it would even increase polarization and division in DC and in state legislatures, resulting in more gridlock. And yeah, it's really those things I think are potential. And so that's my thought.
All right, Seth, what do you think about this? Like, will this turn into a retaliatory and re-retaliatory state that we're going to observe over the next several months?
It does look that way. I think with Texas kicking it off, and how California has a commission that's purportedly nonpartisan and they want to get in on the game. So, of course, there's another angle there. Newsom wants to be president. But I do think that, this is sort of the opening salvo, because there's a long time until the next redistricting, and the midterms right around the corner. So yeah, I think that clearly Democrats understand the stakes, and I think it's real. Texas doesn't bluff. I mean, one of the things that I think Representative Wu forgot about is that when Texas did their redistricting in 2003, and it was wildly successful, Georgia followed up, because Georgia finally won the lower house, and then they put in place a redistricting. Now, the quality of their redistricting for killing Democrats is quite suspect, as a paper I show, but nevertheless, yeah, I think this is sort of a chain reaction.
But to clarify, you found in Georgia the redistricting was not as effective as a gerrymander as it was in Texas back in the early 2000s.
It was this. I should have called it the artful gerrymander. I don't think that was. It was called trying to thread the needle, because they put their premise for redrawing the districts, Republicans did, on making a prettier map, and in serving that goal of a more aesthetically pleasing map, a couple Democrats hung around a little bit longer. So yeah, they were not cutthroat like Republicans in Texas were the cycle before.
All right, and then to wrap up, David, like, what is your take on this potential retaliation from Democratic states, re-retaliation from Republican states? What is it, and then what does it mean for people who really care about reform? Like, where are we right now? Circa summer 2025, for people who want to protect reform around these issues.
It's a dangerous place. I think that I think the Democratic retaliation is limited by opportunity. And I'm not entirely sure where Democrats have strong opportunity on any of the current maps. I think that they have already claimed almost all of the opportunity that they have. And that's going to be extraordinarily frustrating for them. It's going to point them towards California, where, as Professor McCann said, I'm not exactly sure how the timeline is going to function for them. So that's going to lead us, into the midterms. Democrats could attempt an 8-0 map in Maryland. They could attempt to go after, can they push a 14-3 map in Illinois to 15-2 or 16-1? I think that backfires on them. I don't think that you can stretch your voters in those states in that way. Are there a couple seats in New York? I don't think the timeline is going to allow that either. I don't think New Jersey has the appetite for this. So we will see what Republicans do elsewhere. Ohio definitely happens. Missouri appears ready to go. And maybe that will be the end of it. And maybe it won't be. Republicans have a couple of other spots they could look. I agree with Professor McKee. I think it will be a question of how desperate they feel. Do they need to go after an 11-3 map in North Carolina or a couple more seats in Florida to try to lock themselves in? All of this, I think, leaves reform in a fairly precarious place. I think where reform passed, it passed because Democrats, Republicans, and independents got together and made it happen, right? You look at Michigan, you look at Florida, Virginia, California, certainly. These are all cases where voters came together across party lines and they made nonpartisan reform happen. And if all of these questions of what is fair, what is good representation, what is a meaningful election, what is a competitive election, if all of this turns into, well, my side needs to gain 3 seats in the 2026 midterm and you're taking 5, so we're going to come over here and take 7. All of that sets the idea of the nonpartisan coalitions that have come together on these topics. I fear it sets us back a long way. I don't think that's the intention, as the questioner asked earlier, but I think it could be a very real consequence that it becomes harder to certainly the states that have passed these reforms, some of them, I think, probably feel like they've enacted some kind of unilateral disarmament or something, and it might be harder to convince other states to go along and do that. One more reason why, a good national solution would be such an important thing right now.
Thank you all. I think that's a great place to end. I really appreciate everyone's time and the great attendance on a seminar on redistricting and gerrymandering. I want to thank Representative Wu of Texas for coming in and telling us what was going on with gerrymandering in Texas. I want to thank Professor Pam McCann, Professor Seth McKee, and David Daley for participating in this really enlightening discussion. I want to thank all of the questioners who had things to say, and we'll see what happens in Texas and beyond, and follow this redistricting arms race as it continues over the next couple of months or years. Thanks everyone for taking part for this event sponsored by the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. We really appreciate you taking part. Thank you.